On May 25, 2003, the highly controversial psychiatrist, Dr. Richard Gardner, committed suicide. He used a 5-inch serrated steak knife to cut his own throat and then stabbed himself in the heart. It would be interesting to hear what someone like Sigmund Freud would make of all that. But the ghost of Dr. Gardner lives on. His much-disputed theoretical construct, the parental alienation syndrome, appears like a specter in courtrooms across the nation. It appears in divorce cases where child custody has become a highly contested issue and allegations of physical or sexual abuse have been raised. In such cases, the concept of the parental alienation syndrome is often introduced. Basically, it postulates that in the vast majority of cases where allegations of sex abuse are made, it is simply the result of brainwashing by an angry or bitter parent trying to alienate the child in question from the other parent. No doubt, this sometimes happens. But given all that we have learned, to our collective sorrow, about the prevalence in our society of child abuse, sexual or otherwise, that is committed by trusted figures in the community, does it make any sense for any court to operate on the assumption that all allegations of child sexual abuse are probably the result of brainwashing? Shouldn't courts look instead at the evidence? Tonight, we look at the evidence against the parental alienation syndrome and the man who invented it, Dr. Richard Gardner.
In family courts across America, where the welfare of a child often hangs in the balance, one man's theory is being introduced as evidence. The man's name is Dr. Richard Gardner, and the theory is PAS, Parental Alienation Syndrome. Based on what I learned as the producer of Small Justice, Little Justice in America's Family Courts, I came to believe that if judges, lawyers, guardians ad litem, social workers, people who worked in the family court system knew the truth, the outcome for abused children would be very different. So what you are about to see is part of the original interview that I did with Dr. Richard Gardner and part of a television show, Nightbeat, which explored this controversial issue.
I define parental alienation syndrome as a psychiatric disorder that arises almost exclusively, if not exclusively, in the context of child custody disputes, especially litigated child custody disputes. In this disorder, one parent systematically programs the child into a campaign of denigration against the other parent. In addition, the child offers his or her own contributions to the scenarios of denigration, superimposed on and complementing the parental contributions. If it were simply a matter of programming, I would have called it programming or brainwashing. But because it was a combination, I decided some term that might in some way allow for the inclusion of that and not simply restrict itself to the brainwashing concept would be warranted. And what I did see was a syndrome by strict medical definition, and I called it parental alienation syndrome because central to it is alienation of a parent.
Dr. Silberg, first give me a thumbnail sketch in greater detail of what parental alienation syndrome sets out.
Well, parental alienation syndrome was a made-up construct, as you pointed out, that Richard Gardner invented. And his basic theory is that when a child is protesting that they have been abused and there is a custody or divorce situation happening, that the most likely reason is that the parent put the child up to it, and usually Gardner says the mother. Now that is a really frightening thing to have at the outset of any theory, because from the beginning it's telling you don't look at what the child is saying, don't try to make sense of it, prejudge.
Don't listen to your child, even if you're the mother. Garland Waller, you had one of the rare on-camera interviews with Richard Gardner, and you asked him questions about what do you think a mother should do if a child comes to her with a story like this?
Well, I mean, that was one of the most interesting things, is how he responded, because one of the things he said was, what would a good mother do? A good mother would beat her child and say, don't ever talk that way about your father. So if this is what the father of parental alienation syndrome is saying, is if your child tells you something, especially like that, hit your child.
When there is bona fide abuse, you don't see those things.
What do you see?
What do you see? Sometimes you see, I don't believe you. I'm going to beat you for saying it. Don't you ever talk that way again about your father. Denying it. It's stigmatizing the family, keeping it a secret, whereas the false accuser goes on public television, calls up the newspapers, gets interviews. The bona fide abusers aren't as likely to do that, to go on Oprah and tell the world publicly. If he's a doctor, we'll have his license removed. Not thinking for 1 minute, if his license is taken away, you're on welfare. Such illogical, irrational rage that you see in the false accusers. You've given a few of them.
This is from the National Incidence Study of Child Abuse and Neglect by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and they estimate that the number of sexually abused children under the harm standard rose from 119,000 in 1986 to 217,000 in 1993. Now let's take a look at what Dr. Gardner said about allegations.
She subscribes to the rule, believe the children. Children never lie. Well, everybody knows children lie. You believe everything the kid says, so that belief. Would you believe him if he said he was Batman and wants to jump off the roof? You know, would you believe him if he said that he's he just killed somebody? You know, or when he said he didn't hit his brother first, okay, or he made me do it. But in that realm, the child's words. So believe the children is one of the things.
So believe the children when they say somebody touched me in an inappropriate way or hurt me, he says is one of the things he puts in a category with children saying, I'm Batman and I'm going to jump off the roof.
Well, that is really fundamentally discrepant with everything a sensitive, attuned, loving parent knows. They know how to distinguish between something that's important and something that's not important. Can you imagine the invalidation that a child feels if their parent just automatically disbelieves what they say, particularly about something as painful and as horrible as somebody hurt them? It just goes against all of our parenting.
One of the other things that's a difficult issue is that often the idea of some of these allegations seem to come up only in the midst of the divorce. And he says that's a big warning sign that this can't possibly be true. What, from clinical experience, is the normal format in which revelations of I was beaten or sexually abused do come to the surface?
Well, Barry, that is an excellent question, because actually there's a lot of very valid and important reasons why a child will first disclose abuse immediately following a separation between their parents. One of them is that that's the first time they feel safe enough to talk about it. Another might be that that's the time that abuse starts to escalate. In certain households, if the child is then visiting a parent unsupervised, and in that household the abuse is happening that wasn't happening before. Another reason is that sometimes the reason that a mother is leaving in a marital situation is because they've suspected abuse or they themselves have been battered, and there's a strong correlation between being a victim of domestic violence and then having a child be victimized as well.
If the man is violent, and there's good evidence for domestic violence, then he's a poor model for the children. He's likely to be abusive to his children, especially when he doesn't have his wife to use as his scapegoat. And then he will be more likely to be violent to his children. He's serving as a poor model. He's got a low boiling point. These men, I've seen hundreds. These are guys who are animals. And you see, the false sex abuse accusation is a very good way for a woman to protect herself from such animals. because it gets instantaneous restraining order, instantaneous removal, and as long as she believes it, then she can keep him at bay, and it protects her and it protects the children from him. I've seen it. Some of them know it's not true, but it works so beautifully for them. Others don't know, but the fabrication becomes a delusion because it's supported by the zealots from child protection.
In the documentary that you did that touches on this subject, one of the things you found was that when these issues come up, thanks to the parental alienation syndrome being introduced as evidence, that it's actually more likely that the parent accused of misconduct ends up with custody of the child. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, most people don't believe that. It flies in the face of reason. But if the abusing parent goes after custody, most of the time that abusing parent is going to get custody. And I think most people in America would find that not only nauseating, but outrageous. You know, we live in a country where you want to think, we protect our children. And that is not happening in the family courts.
But in this interview with Gardner, he seems to think that judges are far too lenient on the accusing parent, most often women. Let's take a look at another clip from this exclusive interview with Richard Gardner.
But the same thing holds. Judges are very cautious about coming down too heavily on women. A man doesn't pay his alimony support, house arrest Friday night to Monday morning. He's fined, he's punished, he's put in jail. A woman induces a PAS in a child, corrupts the child for life. It's a form of abuse. Judges do nothing. It is politically incorrect to come down too heavily on women, and judges are afraid.
If there's a mountain of evidence in terms of domestic violence, medical evidence in terms of sexual abuse, dad still gets custody?
This has not been my experience, okay? I'm telling you my experience, okay? My experience is with the sex abuse that there are thousands of men on the supervised visitation on no evidence and scintilla of evidence. That's been my experience, okay? And in the cases that I've been, okay? As far as domestic violence, what I've seen is that a woman can say, "You hit me," and they call the police and she can get a restraining order. It's her word against his, but it can take 2 or 3 weeks before there's a hearing. And the judges err on the side of protecting the women. That's been my experience. That's my experience. Can you please show me something in what Gardner has ever written to substantiate that bias? Please show me something. And they will not be able to do it because it's not the truth. It's not true. It's not. That's not the fact. These are the facts. The facts are that in the vast majority of cases, over 38 years, I've recommended that the woman have primary custody. Fact. Fact. In PAS, in the vast majority of PASs, I recommend that the mother has custody even though she's an indoctrinator. Fact. That's the truth.
Well, then why are all the, I mean, I'm doing other things with my life. I'm just recently doing some studies on this. Why is it that, at least it seems to me, that the men's group hold you up as some kind of brilliant expert who's always around, and then the women are out.
Okay, I'll answer that as best I can. Okay. Let's separate PAS from sex abuse. When the sex abuse accusation arises in the context of a custody dispute, as a spin-off of PAS, the vast majority are false. If a woman is angry at her husband for leaving her, she might want to murder him. And women have murdered them, but they know that if they murder the man, they can't just get away with it. A sex abuse accusation is the most powerful weapon ever given to a woman who is angry at a man. You pick up the phone, and within minutes you can destroy his life. I had one case where a woman says to a 7-year-old boy, "Let's play a funny trick on Daddy. You go into the police station, you tell the policeman that Daddy played with your penis, and that he took your penis and he played with it." So the kid goes into, he's 7 years old, he tells the police that the daddy played with his penis. The man's life was destroyed. He was a doctor, and his whole life was destroyed with that joke, okay? It's the most powerful weapon ever given to an angry woman. Men cannot use it as easily because accusing a woman of sexually abusing a child is statistically less common and not as credible. You can accuse the new boyfriend and try that one out for size, but you may have to wait a year or two until she gets a boyfriend, or her father, or something like that. But it happens, but it's not as easily accomplished.
Well, I noticed that at the end of your
So
book,
I'm answering your question, but let's go back.
Okay.
So that the men are very happy because I have literally protected on the immediate level dozens, and maybe by derivative of my work hundreds and thousands from going to jail because of my writings and my the work that I've done. You have to separate what I'm saying now and what I say in my books from what people say I am. Because there's nothing in my book that supports any of it. Nothing. Absolutely. But if one in 1999 even makes one suggestion that one woman, no matter how paranoid, should be robbed of custody of her children, you're suddenly labeled as hating women. If one looks at all my cases, one would say this guy's biased for women.
Just so we're clear here, the court heard allegations that one of the parents was being abusive,
Yes.
and the court, believing in parental alienation syndrome, thought, can't be true, mean, petty, nasty parent planted that in somebody's head, and the court assigns the child to go live with the parent that's accused of abuse.
Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying, and it is far more common than anyone cares to believe. And studies are beginning to document that. We're now beginning to collect a lot of research which is supporting what we've heard from these anecdotes over and over again. In fact, one study finds that 94% of men who asked for custody, regardless of whether they have a history of domestic violence or abuse, are granted it.
One of the things we touched on earlier was the way that Richard Gardner came up with this theory of parental alienation syndrome, and you asked him about it in this interview that you did some time ago. We're gonna go. Let's go to the clip right now.
I'm primarily a clinician. The book you have there has hundreds of clinical vignettes to demonstrate my points. If you're going to say that that's not scientific research, which I don't have a control and an experimental, and therefore the book is not worth reading, and that this book is just figments of my imagination, then give me a prize in creative writing, okay? For having created some of the most dramatic vignettes and creative methods that people can use to alienate. There are hundreds in there. So give me a creative writing award.
So basically, he says this is based not on research or something that's reproducible. It's based on a great collection of anecdotes.
I actually think the irony here is we should give him an award for creative writing because he made this stuff up. He says, give me a creative writing award. Amen. You know, this is information, this is not based on research, and yet they massage on the website. If you go to the website, it makes it look as if there's been some research. There's no credible evidence. There's no credible research.
After your earlier documentary, Small Justice, you began to hear from some people that have survived being assigned to live with the abusive parent, and now they're now old enough to speak out on their own. What are you hearing?
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons that I'm doing this follow-up documentary with the words of Dr. Richard Gardner. These children are turning 18, they are coming forward, and they are saying, a judge didn't listen to me, the guardian ad litem didn't listen to me, nobody in the court listened to me when I told the details of my sexual abuse at the hands of, in many cases, a father. Nobody listened to me. And now they're talking, and now they're being heard. But meanwhile, these children have spent years being abused.
Dr. Silberg, there's something called the Fry Rule in court evidence, and the Fry Rule is supposed to be based on how you judge scientific evidence and which evidence a court should give credibility to. And how does it work in the courts that a doctor that a judge will not give credibility to medical evidence, will not give credibility to a psychiatrist or a counselor or a teacher or an expert, but will listen to a thing called a parental alienation syndrome that really doesn't have peer-reviewed research?
Well, what an excellent question. What I've learned from participating in family court and what's been documented is the rules of evidence that we've come to understand as the basis for how our legal system is devised don't apply in family court. Evidence is completely ignored. The judge has total discretion to let certain things in, reject other things, and what's really ironic is that studies show the higher the level of evidence about a crime of physical or sexual abuse, the more likely the mother is to be sanctioned.
But you've also heard, I gather, from people, not just moms, but you've heard from all kinds of people that say, this system's broken. It's not here in the evidence.
Terribly broken, and it's certainly not just mothers. I have some very unfortunate situations that I'm helping fathers whose wives have been abusive, physically, sexually, or emotionally. It's certainly not as common a scenario, but they too have lost access to their children. The court seems to have a problem with understanding how to make sense of abuse evidence.
In severe cases where the mother is paranoid or is so obsessed with it that there's no way of protecting the children from lifelong alienation from the father, or vice versa. What I recommend, there are a number of recommendations, but for the older child of 11 or 12, juvenile detention centers have kids 12 to 15 or 16. And to see, the children need the excuse. This is a very important point. I say it to the courts all the time. I remember the first case, 1983 or so. It was a PAS case. 7-year-old boy says to me, Dr. Gardner, is it true that if I don't see my father, the judge is going to put my mother in jail? Is that true, Dr. Gardner? Is that true? He's going to put my mother in jail? Every cell in the kid's body is begging me to say yes. So I said, well, you know, that may be. Oh, Mommy goes out to the waiting room. Dr. Gardner says that if I don't visit with Daddy, the judge is going to put you in jail, so I'm going to see Daddy. He was begging for the excuse. You see, they need to be able to say, I really hate him, but I want to protect you from jail, and so I'm going to go see him. They need the excuse to break out, because they love him so much and they want him so much. They're frightened of the programmer. It's not so much love, it's fear of the programmer. So that, I've seen it many times, the kids will say, I'm only going in order to protect my mother, my father. So all you have to do is say to the kid, listen, 11, 14, I'm not talking about 5-year-olds. Now look, you are fully responsible, and if you don't, you are in contempt of court, and you are in defiance of a court order, and the judge can put you in a juvenile detention center. One afternoon, one evening, one weekend will cure the kid. I'm convinced of it. Because then he can say, you wouldn't want me to go to jail, I'll see the son of a bitch, I hate his guts. The same thing with an overnight for the mother. And I'm not talking about in Sing Sing, you know what I mean? Or Rikers Island with hardened criminals. I'm just saying the county jail in a cell overnight will help her remember to get those kids. To just say, for the court to say, 5 p.m. Friday, they're at the father's house. 5:01, they're not there. He has a court order. He calls the police. The police are instructed by the judge to take her away for the weekend, put her in jail till Monday morning, or she's on house arrest. She cannot leave the house, and if she's out of the house, then she's arrested. She's in contempt of court, that kind of thing. The judges are very, very reluctant to do it. I'm not a Nostradamus. I'm not a psychic. I don't have the power to predict the future. I have the ability to extrapolate from the data, to see curves and to see trends that I can see. Every one of my book is based on observations. I saw the need for the Boys and Girls book about divorce. I see PAS. I saw false accusations of sex abuse, 1982, 1983. People said I was crazy. No person now denies that some of these are false. So I do see things earlier. What I'm saying to you is this, that we will see in the next few years more and more people being put in jail for short periods of time for inducing PASs to help them remember not to do it. And why is it now becoming possible? Because of these large burgeoning of PAS, and also more men are now indoctrinators. So it's politically correct. It's okay to put a man in jail. You don't bring about the anger of women if you put a man in jail. And then that will make it easier to put women in jail for the same offense. That's what's happening. It's very frustrating because I know that I have saved many people from jail. I know that I have made important contributions with the PAS. You see, what you have there is a classic. Yes. Think about it a minute. There is one person who has described a new disturbance, a new disease, describing the causes, the development, the clinical manifestations, and the treatment and the prevention in one book for one disease. That rarely happens, and I've done that, and it's an important contribution. And I get a lot of shit thrown in my face because of it, but it's an important contribution. And that knowledge enables me to, not to call it quits at age 68. You know, who needs all this? But I do it because there are people out there begging me for help all over the country, and I know that I'm saving a lot of lives from torture and grief.
He did, however, call it quits not long after that, cutting his own throat with a steak knife. Another interesting quote from Richard Gardner, quote, "The draconian punishments meted out to pedophiles go far beyond what I consider to be the gravity of the crime." Did he just think that part of what kids report may be true, but, oh, stop making such a big deal of it?
Well, you know, what's interesting is when you have a defense that covers the gamut, like, I didn't do it, but she didn't mind it, and she started it anyway. When you have a defense that covers all possible options, you have to look a little beyond it. And sometimes his theories tend to sound like that, like, it didn't happen, but if it did, the child liked it and it was good for them anyway. You have to be critical when you hear a theory that covers those many possibilities.
When you look around on the internet, people talking about Gardner, people talking about parental alienation syndrome, many people think that allegations of sexual abuse are a tool that bitter women use in divorce proceedings, but the root of this whole issue really is about protecting kids from anybody who want to continue to do them harm.
Well, that's what we should be wanting to do, is to protect children. But we do not have a system in our family courts that does that right now, is my opinion.
Give me two changes that child and family courts should make to be able to make this judgment that requires the wisdom of Solomon.
One thing is they need to be evidence-based like criminal court. They need to be looking at evidence, they need to be considering evidence and not base it simply on bias. Number two, throw out the bogus theory of parental alienation syndrome, which just clouds the picture and prevents children from being protected from abuse.
Dr. Joyce Hilberg, Professor Garland Waller, thank you. Keep up the good fight.
Thank you.